to the Crisis Management Policy Deliberation and Decision-Making Workshop. A roundtable. Excellent. If anybody here is not here for that, now is your opportunity to go do something possibly more interesting. Or change what row you're in based on your comfort level. Excellent. So, before we go into the details of this, let me give a little bit of context and then we'll go into introductions. So for Living Games, we all got together, all of us here in fact. So actually, we had a version of this over Google Hangouts. So all of us were like in our own little windows talking with each other back and forth. And as we were having that discussion, we were all commenting on how wonderful it would be to share that conversation with all of you. So this is a version of that. So as part of Living Games, we got together and we discussed how do we handle situations that come up in terms of everything from the code of conduct to practicing the code of conduct to enforcing the code of conduct to dealing with edge case scenarios that come up, and how do we all work together to resolve these issues. But what was interesting from the conversations is that we all come from different perspectives. So as part of the introductions, we'll talk about what those perspectives are and how that perspective can change how you might go about solving these challenges. So let's start with introductions.
All right. I'm Sara Hayley Steele, and I've LARPed since 2003. I've also been involved in radical communities for about 5 years, and have experience deliberating crisis and trauma control in radical communities as well as in LARPs. And I am very much looking at these deliberations from a community building and community retention standpoint, which is not right for everyone, which isn't right if you have certain other considerations, which Sara is going to be representing.
My name is Sara Hart. I'm the co-director of Dystopia Rising Texas and Dystopia Rising Oklahoma. My background is in psychology. My education is in it, as well as a time in behavioral health, which is, can extend from anything in regards to at-risk teens, rehab facilities, and so on and so forth, counseling. I'm coming at this from the perspective of as a business owner, as a small business owner, as well as community management, making sure just a lot of personalities get along, but with the potential legal liabilities that also has entrenched into it.
Hi, I'm Sara Bowman.
Flip the switch. There you go.
I'm Lynne Bowman, and I helped organize this conference. And we spent a lot of time deliberating how we would manage safety. It was a major concern for a lot of our participants. They wanted a code of conduct to be very, very clear and actionable. And we decided to sort of have a multi-pronged attack, for lack of a better word, where we would have a space that was set aside for people that were just feeling overwhelmed emotionally or just needed some time out, but that would also be a place where there would be at least 2 people stationed at any given time. And we also decided to develop these workshops and talks so that we can have an ongoing conversation, because one size does not fit all for all communities. My background is mainly in organizing very, very small parlor LARPs and events. So it's much simpler in certain ways in those situations. But when you have a large-scale event where you're managing lots of people and trying to make sure that everybody feels comfortable, at least some degree of comfort, it becomes vastly more complex.
Cool. And I want to tag on that and emphasize that there are no clear right answers outside of your context and goals. So just like we've been talking about game design a lot at this conference, just like you would have your target game design experience and design around that, you would design your code of conduct, your policies, your deliberation, your conflict resolution systems based on your context, your goals, your constraints. Like we were talking about legal constraints, for example, that would all tie in and affect it. Excellent. So to underline that, there's no one right answer. There might be wrong answers, so we'll see if we can get into that. Cool. So Let's start breaking this down to at least 3 categories: policy / code of conduct, anti-harassment policies, things of that nature. We can talk from our perspectives about what is important to go into that, why, how our context feeds into that. Then we get some questions, we can answer those questions, then move into topic 2, which is deliberation, having conversations with various folks involved. And then topic 3 would be decision making, how to go ahead and once you've talked to the various parties involved, how do you go about making decisions and acting upon them? Great. So let's start with policy / code of conduct. Well, there's no specific order here, so we'll take turns. But the question there is, for your context, and we can use Living Games as an example, what is it important to be put into a policy, into a code of conduct?
Well, I have to say that I definitely consulted a lot of other codes of conduct because I'd never written one before. And for me, it was important that the language was firm but not accusatory, and that it was inclusive, not just for people that maybe are not so socially justice oriented, so that they didn't feel like they were going to immediately be attacked when they walk into the space. And that's maybe a different approach than a lot of people have when they write a code of conduct. They assume that harassment is only going to go one way. And I wanted to make sure that everybody felt like, we would address their needs, as harassment can happen anywhere at any time with anybody. So that was something that I thought a lot about. And actually John helped me amazingly in constructing it, because he suggested having very clear examples of the kinds of things that will be actionable, and what sorts of actions we will take, and then that these would happen in stages. So, for example, if you make an off-color joke, that doesn't mean you're going to get kicked right out, which is what a lot of people hear when they read codes of conduct. And that, we would do everything by case-by-case basis. But the other thing that was really essential is that we are under no obligation to serve anybody. And if it's somebody, we can remove anybody at any time for any reason. Now, of course, that sounds like a power trip when you hear it, but it's actually really liberating, because in geek communities, we often have this fear of exclusion, because many of us have felt excluded at times, and certainly we don't want to promote exclusion as a value. But at times, it's important for everybody involved to feel like that we will take action to take somebody out that is causing problems in the community. And I had to really struggle with this, because it meant that we were going to have to make decisions, and sometimes ahead of time, because we actually let people email ahead of time to let us know if they had a problem. We were going to have to make decisions that were essentially unfair, based on very limited information, that would privilege some people over others. And I did a lot of meditation on it, and kind of spiritually, I came to the conclusion that I want to make sure that people that I feel are positive contributions to the community are protected, and people that I feel that that spread negativity are probably less high on my list in terms of who I want to support in those situations. And of course, it's a case-by-case basis. Unfortunately, we haven't had too many troubles. It's run very, very smoothly. But things do come up. So I also wrote a list of suggested guidelines for behavior, which are not like you must do this, but more just like, hey, in order to avoid conversations escalating, here are some tips. And I was kind of hoping that would set a tone for a conference where people felt that they could feel free to open up and actually talk about things with each other, and may have differing opinions, and hopefully not feel like they're going to be crucified for that.
I'd like to add a couple of details there, since we worked with that together.
Do you want to use the mic?
Yeah, sure. So, as far as the goals of Living Games, and please, Sarah, jump in if I miscommunicate anything. Part of this is it's an international audience. Lots of people come from different cultures, and people who are spending a lot of money traveling, right? So there's a balance, right? So we can remove anyone for almost any reason, but if you paid $1,000 for a flight and are staying in a hotel and have no place to go, and you live about an 8-hour flight away, that could be challenging. So one of the ways that we address that, while retaining that right, is allowing people to send us information before the event, so that if there were conflicts amongst various attendees, we could resolve as much of that up front before the event as we could, to give people more information so they can make decisions about whether they want to attend or not, or what their type of attendance would mean, like what panels or events they might be with other people on, what their participation will look like. Give them more information so they can opt in. And in terms of people coming from different cultures, we want to spell out what the laws locally here were. So for example, different states in the US have different drinking rules. So we want to make it clear, like, here's what consent here means in terms of alcohol. Where people travel from different places, their rules may be different. But, you know, as part of having an event here at this hotel, we have to adhere to certain rules, so we want to make that clear and to make it transparent.
For us, our community standards for Dystopia Rising, I actually want to read from you. It is about 2 sentences, and it's a thing I go back to time and time again. And it can be applied even right now. Look around you. All of us here are all gamers. We are all geeks and nerds and dorks, and I would not have it any other way. When we leave here, we may be lawyers or models or writers or students, but right now, we are all the same. We are all here to have fun, to meet new people, and to experience shared story. Do not be afraid to walk up to someone you have never met before and role play with them. We are here to tell stories and play games. That for us is at the core of what our community is that we are people first who just happen to love to fight zombies in the woods. And I think it's always really important for that to be part of the community standards, to remind people that no matter what shared interests that we might have at this time, when we leave here, we get to put on different hats, we get to be different people, and it turns out, oh my gosh, we're going to be different than our characters. So I've always found that to be really important in regards to a community standard, and just reminding that you are always going to be cooler than the character you play, and you should probably go find out who that real person is behind the mask. With Dystopia Rising, we don't regularly receive pre-information in regards to people who might be attending. A lot of times people just show up, and so we don't really have people sending us emails like, hey, did you know about this person? And to be honest with you, for the most part, unless it is something pertaining to a police report or something that might be on, say, a sex offenders registry, what we try and provide is a space to say, hey, I understand that you fought with that player before, I understand you got out of a bad relationship with that person before, or the many sundry things that can happen within gaming communities. What if this was a second chance? Now, that doesn't mean you have to interact with them. That doesn't mean that you have to go and role play with them. And it doesn't mean that if that person comes up to you, you can't just walk away and go, nope, I'm good with that, because that's your safety, and that's okay. But this mentality of giving people a space to be more than maybe that first perception that you met has actually been a huge boon to us, to be able to just say, hey, just try again. Maybe if this person isn't this guy, this great villain, and now he's your bro who's trying to help save you, maybe that might change things. And you'd be surprised how many times it does. And again, I guess that kind of goes back to reminding people that we're people first and kind of gamers second.
If I could just interject, that works really well because they have a large game. I mean, they have 150 to 300 players, so you can reasonably avoid people.
Yes. In regards to removing players, we are very much the same with a slight difference. In regards to being small business, we can say, hey, I can realize that maybe you're not good. This isn't going to be a good fit for you, and it's not necessarily that you're going to be a bad fit for me, but I can tell that this over here, something about it just doesn't mesh. And we can have the ability to say, we hope that you have a great adventure somewhere else, unless you're under a protected group. which would include things in regards to your race, your faith, or your genders. You know, these are protected rights, and you cannot tell somebody to go away for those reasons. Now, you can absolutely tell somebody that maybe this isn't the right environment for them because of that time you punched that guy, where we are very against punching. And you can say, no, you know, this isn't going to be the right environment for you. But if it's something under a protected group, that's one, we wouldn't, because we're a very inclusive and open community. You know, it's even built into the game system itself that, you know, your race, your gender, you know, your real world faith, those are things that are of the past. Where in the post-apocalypse, that's not important anymore. We've grown past that point. And now there might be other themes, there might be other hard themes, but at least within my community, that stuff is at the mechanical level written in to just not matter. And that's also been another huge boon for the community.
I love segueing from in the communities you're part of. You're in the post-apocalypse, whereas in some of the communities I was doing organizational work on in the Bay Area, we saw ourselves being in utopia, or that's what we were going for in this crazy way. These spaces included hacker spaces, info shops, cooperative living situations, worker co-ops, so businesses owned by the workers in a profit-sharing model. We're going for this pure equity, and there's this idealism, this utopianism that you find in those spaces. And I think there's an interesting correlation with gaming, in which you go to the game space and you're thinking about being in the post-apocalypse. You're thinking about being in this incredible magical space. You're in the Middle Ages, you're in this cyberpunk reality, whatever it is. And then when a problem happens, when one of these very real out-of-game traumatic moments occurs, no one knows how to deal with it because they're in the beautiful imaginative space of the game. And what was when a problem occurred, folks were just a little frozen, like they didn't know what to do. Because this was supposed to be our perfect utopia, gosh darn it, we're living completely equitably, we've removed racism and sexism from this space in all these ways. How could it be that someone committed some abusive behavior against someone else? And this led to so many problems. And something that I began working towards, something that so many people in these communities began working towards, was the development of, I'm not going to call them codes of conduct. We were against codes of conduct because that puts the onus on the individual, and rather talking about community policies. So we're saying, how does the community respond when these things occur? Because as much as you want to imagine your perfect code of conduct is going to be obeyed, it really is up to the community to be ready to respond when someone acts out. So we worked on developing these community policies near the beginning of that period. I'd say kind of late 2011 and beyond, when folks who were involved with some of the protest spaces started getting buildings and started trying to create communities. You had this idea where we'd create these code of conducts that were very ideological, where we were like, we're going to have no racism in this space, and you just state that, and you didn't talk about microaggressions. You didn't talk about the actual on-the-ground stuff that happens. So when those events occurred, people were just sort of frozen, like, oh, that thing we said wasn't in our space is actually here, you know. Suddenly you have like a year of panic and crisis and people walking away, you know, from the space. And it was a very strange, big deal. And what I love about community policies, like 2013, some very firm community policies began to arise, and the idea was to just state ahead of time, if this happens, this is what we will do. And we found this really dramatic shift for people going into the space, knowing what the expectations were, feeling safer in the space because they'd heard the policy ahead of time, and also knew that actual things were going to be addressed rather than folks spouting ideas of what they wish the world was. So I'm a very big fan of writing out either the code of conduct or the community policy ahead of time, and having that in a prominent place for people to see. It really does change the way people interact with the space. So yeah, huge kudos for the way you guys did that for this conference. It was very exciting.
I just wanted to point out really quick that there's a difference between your external policies and your internal policies. We have a very extensive internal policy that actually we shared and we're hoping to make public and generalizable. The idea was to have something that was very clear and very direct and gave instructions on how to handle things. And John wrote up some amazing texts. So hopefully we hope to have that available.
So,
Point of clarification, could you tell us what you mean, the difference between internal and external policy, please?
Absolutely, good question. So an external policy is the code of conduct or the community standards or whatever you want to call it, which is what the sort of the agenda that you're setting for the attendees. So that if I go to a space, I know that if I get harassed, that something will happen. And some codes of conduct are more detailed than others. Some are very detailed, some are just vague. But an internal policy is what we on the safety team will actually do. And the way that we set it up is we had Jack Weeks, who was very helpful in providing security, and John and me be the three sort of main security people. And then we had other people on the safety team that were on staff. So if an incident came up, a private message would go to the three of us that we would then meet and review. So that's not something that we put on our website. That's an internal document, and it's something that we sort of developed after the code of conduct when we were thinking about how we were going to handle things in the space.
and
Thank
we're going
you.
to talk a little bit more about that soon. So that was topic 1. We're going to take some quick questions and then go to topic 2. So if you have questions, raise your hand. And ask your question. If you need to give us context, keep it to like 15 seconds. Don't give us a lot of background because we have very limited time. So keep your hands up. Okay, let's start there.
Yeah, so I had a question which, coming from this from a different point of view and everything like that. One of the things I found I'm curious about and how it works with the whole safety and everything like that is when you guys put out the survey, the questionnaires, like what you want to do and everything like that, you always have the question of who would you not want to LARP with or whatever, right? And that just to have that question on the form just blew my mind because I don't care who, I would never not want to deal with anybody else. But did other people use that to their own advantage and like without telling me anything, of course, but like did that help people?
It's fraught. All of these things are fraught because sometimes you can have the reverse effect that you want to have. So yes, people did use it. There are some people that share gaming space that have bad history and they don't want to be in the same room and they certainly don't want to be cast in romantic roles with each other, recast, or in any kind of intense emotional relationships. But they may be fine coming to a space like this where they can kind of sit on the other side of the room, but they don't necessarily want to be in an involved game with each other. And that also flags to us potential problems that might arise. So we can kind of say, oh, these two people might have some problems, so we'll just keep an eye on it. But one of the suggestions that came up was that people on the other end didn't know who was receiving that information. So they didn't know if that information was actually safe. So I clarified on the form that it was only coming to me and I would be the only one that was managing those exceptions. And if they don't feel safe talking to me, I'm sorry, that's the person that it's coming to. So that's something that it was something that didn't even occur to me. Somebody asked me, why don't you have this on your form? So I put it on the form. And then it was like, why doesn't your form have this extra information?
Awesome. Hands up.
Okay, so I have a kind of serious question, but I have been wondering this. And it's about Dystopia Rising. So I almost didn't come to this conference because DR sponsored it because of the incident in SoCal with the woman who was sexually assaulted and then she posted about it and she got harassed out of the community and then a very good friend of mine got sued and there was all of that. So I was wondering if you could just speak more to that incident and any learnings and takeaways from that incident.
So I represent Dystopia Rising Texas and I represent Dystopia Rising Oklahoma.
Okay.
The truth of the matter is, like the truth of the matter is that I could go over the most tertiary information for you, and by the end of it, you might feel better, which I would hope, which would be my joy to give. But I cannot speak for the actual legalities behind the scene. But what I can say is this, and I've actually expected this one, is that, so at a certain point, whether what took place, there you go. There's a lot of opinions on that in of itself. But here's an interesting thought. So in regards to the legalities, in regards to business, proving things within those kinds of incidences, gross negligence, so on, all the beautiful legal terms I can throw at you. Let's say that the situation might be complicated. Now let's say that other people in the community might face a similar situation. And if their information, if they watched as another person's information was put on blast, put out to absolutely everyone, that the entire curtain was pulled away, how many people would I have coming to me to tell me of incidences? It would drastically get smaller. And that was not the point, and that was not the goal. And so I think that in that specific topic, it's important to remember that maybe the reason that there wasn't a ton of, here's what's going on behind the scenes, is to make sure that it remained a safer space for people of the future.
And let me ask you a quick context question, because this ties into the panel, which is we're all coming from different contexts. So in your example, you're a franchise, right, of a certain state representing this. Do you have any authority or ability to affect what other franchises do?
Absolutely not.
So that's
and to a certain degree, neither does the national organization, unfortunately. They can control content, and there are certain ways that they can remove a person, but they weren't provided with the necessary steps that were in the contract in order for that to be fulfilled. Additionally, they have made a public post about this on their website if you'd like to read the details recently.
cool. And just one thing, because you mentioned the contract, that's something to think about. If you're franchising and you know that there's different elements in different states that you may not have a lot of control over, and these situations could come up, how could you write the contract in a way that you do have agency and do have the ability to affect things in that sort of situation? Because that's where like the context and the legalities and the contracts make a big difference, because people may have not thought about certain situations when they're writing the contract, but then they occur, but the contract's already established. So something to think about for the future. That's it. 1 second. Hands up.
Yeah. So in Nordic countries, we're pretty new with codes of conduct in general, and we're learning a lot of this stuff on the internet, and it's still a little bit debated. There is this idea that you also already touched upon, but I'd just like to speak to this specifically, that the code of conduct can be a crutch, that if you want to design the culture, like the rules are not enough fallacy. So is there, first I'd like to hear you reflect on this, and then the second is, do you know of like other ways of designing culture that you think could have like an immediate impact?
Well, I guess when you're approaching the situation from the point of view of creating a community policy for handling events rather than necessarily a code of conduct, which, as we know, isn't necessarily going to translate into behaviors. So in a venue space I worked to establish early this year, I was very much sort of the benevolent dictator around writing the community policy. I'm just like, okay, like I already know what can happen in these spaces from having worked with many venues before. And so there's a matter of writing out, like for example, we have a safer space policy for this venue in which if a victim comes forth, the victim is immediately believed. There isn't a punishment model, but rather whoever is triggering them or whoever has committed something against them is separated from the space. The idea is to not have someone that's, if someone has been victimized and triggered in the space, to not have the aggressor staying in the space, triggering them, putting them in an emotional state, and then pushing them to leave, which is sort of, usually what happens. But if you're like, all right, let's socially engineer this a little bit, let's have the accused aggressor leave, not as a punishment thing, just being like, all right, we need to get you separate from this person while we figure out what happened and start creating a plan as a community. And there, in that community policy, there isn't specification around what plan will be used. The community gets to decide that. But the idea is that immediately the members of the community are taking responsibility for building that plan with the person who has experienced victimization. And everyone going into the community reads that, it's read aloud to them, and they sign it. So you're prepared to say, hey, like, as a member of this community, I'm taking the onus upon myself to be present and ready to deal with these situations when they come up. But there are tactics that can be developed in social engineering that do address these things, but I believe it certainly has to be a community agreement, that it can't be on the individual to say, I won't be bad, that just, it doesn't work.
And I want to add a quick thing, which is, because that's an amazing question, and I think we could talk about that for 4 hours, and I hope we do, actually. But I'm going to use that as an example, which is I think a lot of questions will come up that are like that, and hopefully they will inspire further conversations beyond the limited time we have for this panel. That said, there were additional questions.
I have 2 questions. One builds on that a little bit.
Let's start with the first one because we have limited time.
Okay. The first one is, how do you deal with issues, like, what is your policy for issues of people who have committed crimes and are the sex offenders that are on databases, sex offenders who are no longer on the database, people who have committed felonies that are, have served their time and are now out of jail, and how do you deal with them?
So I mentioned a word, I mentioned a phrase earlier called gross negligence. It is a thing that frots my nightmares. And it is a legal term. And what it means that as a business is that if I am in the know about an individual with a violent background, a sexual predator background, so on and so forth, and I bring them into a community where that could be, that they could be an interaction with the same community or something bad might happen. It is negligent of me to not protect my community. And that then goes to a legal level later on, were something to happen. So that is something that I'm actually always kind of having to be aware of. So, I mean, for some people, it won't be a black and white answer. For many people, it's going to be in many shades of gray. But for me, it is a black and white answer because it is never a risk that I am able to take.
And when we say gross negligence, and of course it depends on your country, your state, because even in the U.S. every state's very different. If you know the situation, and it can be proved that you know the situation and you ignored it, it could be proven that you have displayed gross negligence, which can be used to pierce your corporate protection and come after you personally for your assets.
Thank you for the greater clarification. I appreciate that.
Excellent. Let's see there, and then we may come back to the second question.
Sure. So actually following up on what was already said about trying to develop policies in new areas that don't have them all, and what you said, Sarah, about borrowing from a lot of places, I really like a lot of the stuff that you wrote, and I want to know if I can steal it.
Everybody can steal anything of mine.
Wait, it's on record.
Wait.
Including our food at our house, it's a rule. Just cite it. But that's the thing. New World Magic School has taken most of it, and I'm very pleased for them to use it. I don't think one of the problems we have as large communities is we think we have to reinvent the wheel all the time. And I know I felt very intimidated by having to do this, and it was actually a really painful period during the process of creating this. But I'm very happy that I was supported, and I asked for help, and help was offered, and we were able to create something that I feel is maybe sustainable. I mean, of course, we have to iterate it, and we have to stress tested and all of that stuff. But we hope that this model might be useful in other people's cons and even games moving forward.
And I'd like to add a sentence.
Yeah.
Please, if you have a group or community or game or anything without a policy, steal it, because having the policy in advance is incredibly, incredibly better than having to come up with one after a situation arises.
Yes. And having the email allowing people to report things ahead of time can help make people feel more reassured as well.
And I would add really quickly to that part of this is almost like an open source model, right? We're experimenting, we're releasing our material, encouraging other people to use it. But just like here, we come from different contexts. Your event, your community, your convention may have its own goals, its own constraints. So we would love to see you evolve those policies and let us know why you made the choices you made and how that your context informs that. Cool. So let's move to topic 2. And in the interest of time, we might blur topic 2 and 3 together so we can get more wonderful questions. So the topic 2 and 3 were dealing with deliberating, communicating with people in your community at your event when incidences occur. And the topic 3 was decision making. So like you may communicate with people, but then the staff or equivalent may meet afterwards to decide what to do about something. So maybe we can talk about blurring those together and then we'll see where it goes. Who would like to start?
I guess just to reiterate what the model we kind of came up with is if there's an incident that comes up, one of the 3 of us would be made aware of it. We have a private form that people could send in an allegation report, and that is only if the reporter wants to. And then this is very, very important, because if a reporter feels like everything that they do is going to be reported, then they may feel less safe reporting it, especially if they think there are going to be repercussions for it. And then we have a separate action report that details what action we take as staff. So that's something that John engineered and is, I thought was, I don't think we necessarily needed to use it, but it was great that it was there. So that's part of it. But then the other part of it is that we didn't really want people making on-the-fly decisions without consulting the rest of us, because what might be okay for me might not be okay for John, and vice versa. So we tried to build in a system that unless it's a clear action needs to be taken, like somebody's like beating someone up, like that's when the police need to be involved immediately. But like if it's something that we can spend some time sort of talking about, separating the individuals is definitely very important. But also getting the 3 of us together that are sort of the leads to kind of discuss what we want to do about it. And also empowering them, if I'm busy doing a thing, to make those decisions as needed. I feel like the way that it sort of happened was very organic, and there were times when things were addressed, and they were, I feel like they were easily handled for the most part.
Yeah, and I would add that part of the communication element there was one of agency and enforcing agency. So when we have staff members talking to people involved in an incident, we always ask them questions. We always ask them for their consent. We don't take actions unless they have agreed to those actions, including filing a report, speaking to the person that might be allegedly harassing them. We make sure that they have the agency. We don't make assumptions. We don't act like the hero trying to save them. Whatever they're interested in, whatever they're comfortable with, we go with that, with the understanding that that could change. They could initially say, this is what I want, and 2 hours later that could change, and that's okay. In addition, a big part of this was the sanctuary space, to give people a chance to have a time out so that they can reflect. We can give them whatever they want. If they want a blanket, if they want a coloring book to color in, or if they want food or drinks, we facilitate that. We help them to give them non-pressured space so that they can digest the situation and then feel comfortable coming to us and to be safe and clear about what help they need, and then we use that to decide the next steps.
And there's 3 wonderful pieces in there. You are not Batman, you are not the police, and you are not Sherlock Holmes.
Man, those 3 principles are real. And absolutely for us as well. You know, you are not an investigatory body. You know, if there is a real world concern, it has to go to the real world authorities. It just has to. It's for your safety, and it's absolutely for theirs. But it's also not something that you can force. It's also something that you can only recommend and help people to feel like they're in a safer space. And I know we keep using that word, and it's not safe space, because true safe, you know, perfect safe spaces, they're always growing. We're always learning new things that we could possibly do. It's about creating a safer one, because we can grow from that. As I mean, look back on the gaming community 10 years ago. How different is it? It's for me, it's significantly different. So what we do is that we make sure that the leadership is clear. Where does the buck stop? And it stops with myself and my co-director. And we make that very clear with our staff, our marshals, and our STs. And maybe that's something to discuss. We have a team of what we call marshals, and then on top of that, then we have STs, and then we have the directors themselves. So, in any of these tiers, you might hear about something that has occurred, something, a fight that might be brewing, or something that's happening during the downtime in between from game to game. We only have events once a month, so there's also this, 3-4, week break in between, where people will hopefully just be being really great people to one another. That's my hope and dream. And so what it means is that we will consistently get information back from those members who love the community and who love the game as much as we do. And we also create, the best that anyone can, an open door policy. I make myself available, sometimes maybe to my great detriment, as would be, in the words of Lizzie Stark in the audience, and creating safer spaces for other people. But maybe that's also something to bring up. At what point does an organizer also get a safer space and a place to decompress and debrief? Because these things are hard. These issues that we go through are really difficult, and many times we're not prepared for. And so the only thing you can do is think ahead and go, what can I put in place for if this happens? And so for us, it's making that leadership clear. For us, it's making sure that our staff is a part of many different groups, many different friendships, so that we can hear from all over the community if there is an issue. Saying it over and over and over. That little paragraph that I read to you, that's not our complete code of conduct. It goes on and on and on about our expectations and about the community which we want to grow. Because it's more than a game, it's the community that we want to attract like to like to. And we say it at every opening announcement, at every closing announcement, on the internet and our social media, as often as we can, so that people, I honestly don't even mind if it ever gets to a point where somebody is just hearing that as white noise. I know I've said it enough, and that's good. I'm actually okay with that. But when an issue is brought up the chain, the buck stops up there at the top. So you always know who are the two people who are deliberating on this. And the honest answer is that you really just take the rules of treating people like how you want to be treated. Do you want to, do you want to be talked to in a room with the person that might be your aggressor? I don't. I know that I would want to be, talked to in this manner, but it's also checking in with those people and saying, hey, what are you comfortable with? What will this be aggravating to you? Before you even touch a person, hey, are you responsive to touch? Are you okay with me giving you a hug? Because not everybody is, and that is such a great de-escalation just thing to do, to just show that, hey, everything is actually going to be okay. You are in a safer place. Look, I'm no longer a monster in the woods. Now we're just real people. So the deliberation usually will happen between people who have been separated and have been put into safer spaces, because again, we are not an investigatory body, and nor we're just a community of nerds who want to go and have fun, and so every situation will change. Every situation will be different, and as long as you're going into that knowing that you have to be really good at improv and really good at people's real life feelings, you'll actually most of the time make the right decision. And that's the truth, that nobody tells you that there isn't one right answer for this situation. It depends on the people in it, because like you said, people at the start of it might be really aggravated, and by the end of it they're like, oh man, I just had some bleed. Sorry. And that's okay. It's okay to feel. Feelings are real.
I'm so excited about so many of the things Sara just said, and so I come from a neuro/alliance background. 13 years ago, there wasn't anything public about safe space. It wasn't spoken about by organizers. In the chapters in which I was a staff member and player, we had many instances that occurred, and there was no space for the stalking, the harassment, the rape that happened to be brought forward. Players just disappeared. There were just war stories, that came out of those experiences where folks had these things happen, there wasn't space to address them, and then they would leave the game, and you might run into them 2 years later and find out, oh, you were stalked, 15-year-old girl stalked by a 35-year-old, followed her out on a camping trip with her parents and showed up in the woods. Like, these kind of things happened endemically in the early 2000s in campaign LARP, and there was simply no recourse by making these statements, by having the organizers make these statements, by having the rule books mention these things, by having code of conduct policies. The space has been opened for people to step forward, and that I see as being just a huge and beautiful shift in LARPing. But in terms of addressing the stuff on the ground that does now emerge, thank goodness, that does now come into our plates as organizers. I heard Jane McGonigal on NPR a few weeks ago, and there was this great talk she made about giving people a game of Tetris to play if they've experienced trauma. Apparently, if you're gaming one of those super intense, high-focus games, within 24 hours of a traumatic experience, it reduces the likelihood of experiencing PTSD by over 50%. It's a very strange phenomenon, but there are parts of the brain that can be sort of rerouted from the trauma reenactment that might be going on by engaging in a high-focus activity. So in that first response moment, you might think, okay, what do I have for this person? Do I have a Game Boy with Tetris on it? And putting that in your in your medic kit. But I highly recommend checking out that 15-minute NPR talk that she gives on those studies. But once someone has come forward, you're put in this spot of deliberation of what do you do next? And something really worth thinking about in terms of the social structure of your organization is that deliberation a community thing? Is that part of a safer spaces committee? Is that going to an individual? And having it very clear to folks who they go to, so they know, all right, that person is with the Safer Spaces Committee, so I can talk to that person. The recommendation is to make sure there are multiple people that have been denoted as folks that one can come forward to. But when deliberations do happen, whether it's the whole community deliberating or a small group, or just an organizer, getting out of the punishment model and focusing more on safety, because there are problems that emerge with punishment in terms of playing the cowboy, playing the hero or rescuer, that ultimately doesn't help the victim as much as just saying, what can I do to help the victim feel safe? So in terms of deliberation, just kind of keeping the emphasis away from punishment, away from it, has that person suffered enough based on what they did, and just saying, how can we make sure the victim feels safe? That's one of the big things that folks have to decide about.
And did you have a reintegration model in your community?
I was
What's that?
thinking of holding that for the third question, but you know,
I think we were rolling them
Yeah,
together.
let's roll it together.
So, restorative justice is a model that's been under development for a while in community building models, where you're like, rather than aiming to isolate and punish offenders, we want to heal this community. And if that's your first goal, and if you're not concerned about gross negligence, if you're not in a situation of saying, okay, I could get sued, like it's I think important to make the differentiation between the responsibilities of a business owner legally and the responsibility of a community builder. And if you're in a decentralized community, if you don't have the same legal obligations, this, I would say, is a much better model. You're forming a community council that works with the person who's experienced victimization or who's been the target of an aggression, to figure out what they need to feel better and to potentially let the person come back. We had this play out at Arizmendi Bakery, a worker cooperative bakery in Berkeley. Someone was just aggressively hitting on a staff member, not a huge infraction, but a restorative justice model was evoked, in which the person who was experiencing that constant sexualization from this other worker, she decided what she needed for him to be able to come back was to just get an apology letter from him, and that was it. But the rest of the community, worked with her to develop this at her own pace, and ultimately he actually stepped away rather than writing the letter, which is kind of unfortunate. And I am excited to find models where the perpetrator is able to re-enter the community in a more fluid way. And as I've seen it play out so far, the person who targeted the person usually walks away from the community at that point. And so this is a process that's still under development, and still has problems to work out. But it does reverse the former pattern of the victim being pushed out of the space for their own emotional safety. So it's like, okay, well, at least we can make sure we're holding space for folks who have been victimized, rather than often having repeat offenders, which was something that occurred quite a bit more in these spaces before implementing a restorative justice and safe space model, where you have, 5 people victimized, before someone comes up, or years and years of having many people come up, and rather believing the first victim and getting the person out of there. We're seeing less of that, but the goal is to have a better model for reintegrating those folks within the community. So it's a process that's still under development.
I would just like to add one thing that I just want to make sure we touch on. There's quite a bit of debate over whether these decisions should be transparent or whether they should be internal. Meaning that whether or not these decisions should be made by the whole community in front of the whole community, or whether they should just, like, where the buck stops here kind of thing, where maybe 2 people decide and then announce their decision. And there are pros and cons to both, obviously. We are a community-based activity, and sometimes it feels sort of arbitrary if people make a decision. It's like, well, what about our feelings? What if we don't agree with that decision? But I would like to emphasize that what I've seen in the last year, with several instances that have gone public on the internet, is that the entire community ends up getting traumatized by one person's bad actions, or one person's alleged bad actions. And it becomes so divisive that it actually damages people and the community itself on such an extreme level, that transparency has a cost. And that's just something that I wanted to make clear. I'm not saying that transparency is bad, and sometimes it's probably good to let people know about perpetrators, but there is a cost.
And I just would add really quickly that if there's a situation where transparency makes sense, please make sure the people involved, especially the people who've been victimized and survived the situation, opt into that. Because there have been situations where someone makes a report and they were under the idea that it would be kept private, and then it was made public, right? And then that can cause a lot of trauma and problems for the person who's already been traumatized. That said, we have 7 minutes. Let's take questions. Raise your hand. Let's start here.
So speaking to the early 2000s and some things that obviously were going on in Warwick at that time, you know, we've solved a lot of the problems and we've really moved forward, but how do you deal with, as a business owner and a community leader, both, if you have somebody come to you and say, this transgression has just happened to me, and it's something that is probably needs to go to the police, but that person is not comfortable and does not feel safe making that report. Like, what do I do for that person to support them when, without that report now, I can't do anything about this other person, and they may then be perpetuating this in my community?
Could I jump in really quick?
Oh, yeah.
Especially because I want to tag with what you said before. And where I work, we are funded by the Annie Casey Foundation, which one of their stated goals is to reduce trauma in survivors. And so, like, to back what you were saying, Hayley, about for some people who've just gone through trauma, doing things like playing Tetris for 24 hours or some length of time really helps them. We've seen many situations, and it's very well documented and online. You can see many research studies where people go to the police immediately after a trauma, and then they're re-traumatized in that the police will try to figure out what is true and what is false, right? And by trying to determine what is true and what is false, there's the insinuation, what are you lying about, right? And someone who's just been traumatized, who's having the spotlight and being interrogated right after this has occurred, can be really harmful to them. So that's something to keep in mind, which is why we often don't pressure people to do that, although it's understandable that having a written document and paper trail can help, especially for a future legal case. So that's an option to keep in mind. But I would add that you can file a police report days, weeks later. Like, it doesn't have to be in that moment. Like, all these options should be weighed, the pros, the cons, the risks, the potential harm, and then figure out what makes the most sense. Cool.
I just wanted to say, not playing Tetris for 24 hours, but like 20 minutes of Tetris within 24 hours of the event. 24 hours
So
is a little overkill.
I set the bar a little high.
Yeah, right.
And I would add that this has also been suggested to help with like post-LARP blues or post-LARP depression, is just do another immersive activity that can kind of help distract you from those emotions. So it can be used in other contexts.
I have to chime in, I'm so sorry. Specifically on that topic, 100% so hard. It is so hard to have a person come forward, especially if they have to go to the police. The best thing, in my opinion, that you can do to be supportive is just to be there. It is to remove from them that situation. It is to give them a calm space. It might be leaving that campus entirely. But you just provide them with what they need, and that's to let them know, hey, this is my background, this is what I've been through, now tell me about you, because you are not alone.
I guess I'm in this weird and ambiguous space of having seen parts of reality that I really, wish didn't exist, but have to acknowledge they do. And, there was a woman in the community who in 2012 experienced a situation and called the police, and they came to her apartment, and she panicked and was actually came down and beaten up by police. This is one of my friends in Davis, California, and Davis and that kind of region of California, there is a situation with problematic members of the police department, often ones who have been charges filed against them are transferred to university campuses. These are actually university police that pinned her down and beat her in her apartment. So there's this funny moment where I, at least in that region, when I'm there, I am not going to call the police for a survivor of immediate trauma because I just don't know who's going to show up, and that sucks.
And I'd also like to state I recently did a very excellent training on rape and for a school that I teach for, and it describes some of the physiological effects of rape, including sort of like playing dead. So it may seem like it's consensual when it wasn't. And there's also some cognitive things that happen where they may not remember events correctly. So a police report may not actually reveal, it may reveal conflicting information, might get easily thrown out, which actually makes it much worse for the victim.
Cool. We have 2 minutes. You got a question?
So what do you do with, if the police report doesn't go through, what do you do if the community is pushing back against what you're doing because they don't believe this survivor or something like that? If the community as a whole.
I think for me, and I haven't had to fortunately do this yet, but it boils down to what behavior do I want to promote and who do I want to protect in my community? Do I want to let somebody who I believe is harmful, do I want to set that as the norm?